Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts. I'm excited today because we have another story episode, and this time's guest is phenomenal. We're going to be talking with Mike Maeshiro, which I'll tell you about a little bit more in just a moment. And he is going to be joining us to talk about his experience at Bethel, which is in Redding, California, as well as his experience within the Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry, which is very, very interesting. And I'm excited to have everybody hear the ins and outs of the Bethel culture. And truly, it is a culture, as you will hear Mike talk about. So I'm really excited for everybody to hear his story, and especially for those of you who are maybe coming out of Bethel or another charismatic denomination. I think some of the things that you'll hear today you might resonate with, and even if you didn't come out of a denomination like Bethel or Pentecostal, charismatic, I think you're still going to get a lot out of this episode. As we know, so many high control religions have so many of the same underlying motivations and practices, even if they might be, if they kind of come out in a different way. So I think you'll enjoy this week's episode. And as always, we do recognize that sometimes the things that we talk about might bring up feelings, emotions, triggers, things like that, and could be too much to handle right now. So if you need to, please always feel free to skip any episode or parts of episode and come back if and when you're ready. Our goal is to help you trust your own body and lived experience. So go ahead and take what you need and leave what you don't. Mike Maeshiro is the founder of Pneuma, an organization that supports people recovering from religious toxicity. Mike is gay, an advocate for the LGBTQ+ community, and a queer theology enthusiast. Mike is a former instructor at Bethel's School of Supernatural Ministry, best known for his class, quote-unquote, Discerning of Spirits. He now teaches on emotional health and redemptive deconstruction. He is a consultant and coach for gay men recovering from evangelicalism. He also has a team of coaches who work with people whose faith is evolving. He is a social media influencer and thought leader. Mike loves Japanese food, movies, and playing volleyball, and has a depth of useless knowledge about the X-Men. So with that, let's invite Mike Maeshiro to the Sunday School Dropouts podcast. Welcome, Mike, to the Sunday School Dropouts podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Laura. It's great to be here. I'm honored and excited. I saw your questions and I was like, oh, here we go.
Yeah, here we go. Yeah, so I'm excited because you have a background that I feel like people have heard about this church. They have maybe sung their songs. They have, heard the horror stories, but you have lived it. We of course are talking about Bethel, which is so awesome. But before we get to Bethel, I am really curious to know, did you grow up in a Bethel type church, or was that something you transitioned to later on in life? Give us the deets.
Yeah, it was later. So I grew up in the Baptist denomination, very conservative, evangelical. And then when I was in high school, we went to a non-denominational church, but I mean, they were not too far from Baptist. They could use guitars and drums and stuff at this church.
Yes.
But theologically, it was still pretty much the same. And then when I was 18, I started having some pretty intense spiritual experiences that my non-denominational church community and pastors didn't really have answers for me about. I was experiencing my spirituality at a level that was life-altering, and I needed answers. And I was being transformed as a person in some profound and important and lasting ways, and people were looking at me like, what are you talking about? So I went on a pilgrimage of sorts. I didn't mean to. It just kind of happened, and through some dramatic months of my life, I landed in Redding, California, and went to Bethel, and I studied at Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry. And then anyway, so I joined the Bethel charismatic version of Christianity around 20 in my life. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm really curious to know all about it, what it was like being at Bethel, especially the School of Supernatural Ministry. But I mean, I'm not familiar. I know at different places like Hillsong, it's you go to the school, but then you're also serving at the church and, that sort of thing. Was there a crossover? Whatever you want to share is great, because I think this is fascinating.
Yeah. Okay. So my job right now is to whittle down what don't I share, right? Because there's just
Ah,
so much. And I think
yes. Yeah.
coming from a different culture and then ending up in Bethel at the time that I did, I had a better maybe clarity around the strangeness and distinction about the culture than people around me. Because a lot of the people at school were raised in Pentecostal, charismatic, Assemblies of God type churches their whole lives, and that was not my upbringing. So I was kind of a little bit of an outsider in that regard, and so I had a bit of an anthropological attitude and like take on so much of what I was witnessing because I was like, help me make this make sense. What is happening right now? Why is that happening? So one of the more shocking things that I encountered initially when I went to Bethel, I took a Sunday school class called Fire Starters. It was like a 12-week course. It's a class where you learn about like Bethel's core ideas about regarding revival culture and like especially being drunk in the Spirit, the gifts of the Spirit, speaking in tongues, that kind of prophecy. And that class was probably one of the more wild spaces I occupied at Bethel ever. Like it was probably one of the most obnoxious, strange spaces, and it was like one of the first ones that I experienced. So I got thrown in on the deep end. Thankfully, I had a table leader who was from like the South, and she was very down to earth and like answered my questions and wasn't fazed by them. But like I'm like, why is that person convulsing in the corner over there? Why is everyone screaming right now? Why is everyone laughing? What's funny? It's not fun. Like, so there was a lot of, especially in that class, but then in other services, depending on the speaker, that would be a thing that would happen. People would just kind of erupt into fits of laughter.
Yeah.
They would call this being drunk in the Spirit or filled with the Spirit or manifesting, you know. It wasn't just laughing though. Sometimes, not sometimes, often, people would also shake wildly and then sometimes yell along with the shaking or the gyrations or whatever. And it's weird to describe this stuff in English because there's so much you can't really describe. But it's like an atmosphere of chaos, you know, just people, and they would call it freedom, right? People are being given permission and freedom to let the Holy Spirit do what the Holy Spirit's doing. And so for a lot of people, the Holy Spirit would shake them, throw them on the floor, make them laugh hysterically or sob or scream. And so that was like a very strong theme of the atmospheres I was in for the first while. And then going to school, that was also very much part of the experience. And you could tell, like, some of this was cultural. Like, some of these people had been raised to do an experience, and I had not. And so for 2 years in school, I never once experienced convulsing or laughing hysterically. I mean, I laughed because I was laughing at people. Like, and I wasn't trying to be rude. I just, like, couldn't, I didn't know how to process what I was seeing. I'm like, this is absurd. Like, what are we doing? But yeah, there were definitely times during ministry in school where all of my students around me are like fellow students are like falling over, they're laughing, they're, you know, they're being slain in the Spirit. There's lots of different terms for things. And I'm just like standing there, you know, like unfazed. It'd be like me and like 9 other people in a room of 800 students who are like writhing and yelling and laughing. And you're like, this is so weird. But the thing is, like, one of the unique things about humanity is like we can adapt, right? So after doing this for so long, you don't even notice it anymore. It just kind of becomes you're unfazed. Like, it's just part of how it works. You know, it's just the deal. Yeah, I just spent a lot of time ignoring things or like rationalizing them away. I never could bring myself to perform or like fake it, you know? Not with the tongues, not with the laughing, not with the manifesting. I couldn't fake it. I don't know, it just like would violate core values of mine. But that did come with some like awkwardness for me because that meant that I didn't really fit in, you know? Like I was kind of a weirdo in the weirdo stream. But anyway, so like that was like a really strong initial outward observation, you know, that did not go away for the entirety of my time there. Anyway, so I might need you to ask another question to help me know which direction to go.
Well, I'm curious to know. Okay, so we have the Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry, which the word school implies that you're training to do something. And I'm assuming this is like a professional ministry job. So is this pastoral? Is this missionary? What is kind of the point of going to a school like this?
Yeah, great question. When I first went there, I did not know the answer to that. I didn't know. I think most of us didn't know. Some people do go there specifically for their careers. And so, you know, going to a school like this, I think often the hopes There are some tracks that people get in, right? So some people came to Bethel to ministry school specifically to become rock star worship leaders, right? And like to be trained in by the best of the best, which to be fair, like I think Bethel is the best of the best when it comes to worship and like spontaneous, spirit-filled type worship settings. I don't know that I had encountered better than Bethel. Back when I was still in that world. I'm not saying there isn't better now, but I've been out of it for like 5 years. But anyway, so some people it's like straight up worship, like they want to become worship rock stars or like trained, and they've got an efficient system of training for people to become Bethel worship leaders, right? Which is impressive and whatever. Some people go there to learn specifically about like healing or prophecy. Like they want to just like be more gifted and skilled in those areas, whether that means they get a vocation in that, doing something like that or not. Some people went there to become itinerant ministers, which I didn't know even what that was before Bethel, right? Which is funny because that's what I ended up becoming. It's one of the things that I did was like I started traveling and preaching because of my, credentials with Bethel and whatever. But so some people, that's their goal. Others, like they want to go back to their church and just go into pastoral ministry, or like serve at their home church or another church. So I think a lot of people came to BSSM to go into vocational ministry. What that looked like varied. It depended on the types of ministry they were attracted to. And there were a lot more options than I ever knew before I went there. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, because it is so interesting to me. And I think, so I grew up in, have an evangelical background, very, familiar with Baptist, everything you're talking about, had friends in the Assemblies of God Church. So am, a little bit familiar with Pentecostalism, more charismatic. But I feel like the rise of Bethel must have kind of come after I left all of that behind, because I hadn't heard of Bethel until, probably 7, 8, 9 years ago, when people were coming out of it saying, oh, this experience. So, when you're there, you're at the school, you're serving. I mean, is it like this is your life, your entire community, identity, finances, it's all there?
Yes.
Tell me
absolutely.
about that. Yeah.
I'm embarrassed to say anything about to tell you because it just feels like, why would anybody choose this? But absolutely it is that. And it's funny, I'm publishing a memoir right now in episodic formats on my Substack, and I'm in the middle of like having just gotten hired at Bethel on staff. My boss is one of the drunkest people in the environment, and the things that she did were unbelievable. And so it's like kind of fresh. And so this like great timing. But when you go to Bethel, this is not required or mandated by any means. No one tells you to do this, but this absolutely happens. It's a pipeline.
Yeah.
You live with Bethel people, you go to school with Bethel people, you go to church with Bethel people, you serve with Bethel people, and there are so many opportunities and ways to serve, right? There's the homeless ministry. I'm not even going to be able to name all of them. There's the healing rooms, there's the prophetic ministry, there's inner healing, so the transformation center. There's the prayer, like what they call prayer servants is what they were called, so just being on the prayer line. And there are people who would come to every conference Bethel had, and they would be there to pray for people, and that was like such a passion of theirs, which was interesting for me to observe, because I ended up working in the events department, and I watched these same students or just people come to event, and I'm like, what are you doing here? Like, don't you have other things you want to do with your life? Why are you at another conference? And I would kind of judge them a little, because I wasn't raised in conference culture, but a lot of people in this world, that was their lives. Like they went to conferences all the time. They would go live from conference to conference to just continue to get the fire of God, or whatever, however they'd phrase that. And I didn't understand that culturally, but 100% everyone I lived with, went to school with, went to church with, like we were Bethel. The only space I interacted with people who weren't Bethel people was the jobs that I had before I worked at Bethel. So mainly I worked at Red Lobster as a host and then server while I was going through school. And so I had friends and new people, like coworkers who weren't Bethel in that regard. And I really enjoyed those friendships because of that diversity and the contrast and whatever. But then outside of that, everyone I knew went to and drank Bethel. Yeah.
Wow.
And that wasn't unique to me. That was true for most of the people I knew at that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with people like consulting and clients and things like that have had very similar experiences at Bethel, and yeah, that it's Bethel everything. I'm not familiar with like the size of Redding, California. Is it big, small? Like, I mean, I'm assuming that Bethel just takes over the town, similar to how Liberty takes over Lynchburg.
Yeah, Bethel. So Reading's like 100. When I lived there, which was like 3 years ago, it was 100,000 people, and Reading
Yeah.
makes up, or sorry, Bethel makes up about 14,000 of the 100,000. So it's like a sizable
That's
portion of the
a
population.
large
Yeah.
percentage.
hmm
Yeah. Yeah. So everybody knows it there.
Yeah. You either love or you hate Bethel. There's like not a lot of
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
between. Yeah.
I
In
get
Reading.
that. I get that. I went to Liberty University for my master's degree, and so I have a lot. I was gonna say a lot of shame. I got a good education, but I've got stories. But I went back there this year to speak at the University of Lynchburg, which was the first time I'd been back to Lynchburg since I graduated, and it was so interesting to hear the perspective of people that did not go to Liberty, because similar to you, it was like this love-hate relationship. They couldn't deny like the economic pieces of what Liberty brought to the city. Same, I'm sure, with Bethel.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, then there's like this expectation that, you do what Bethel says or you do what Liberty says because they basically own the city.
Yeah. Yeah. That
Yeah.
was, unspoken, right? And like the leaders would be gracious in how they talked about and spoke, and they'd come across very humble. But for sure, I mean, if you're not a Bethel person, it is alarming the level of influence and like in not just in government, in business, like the amount of development that happened in Reading because of Bethel and Bethel people. Right? It was
It's intense.
it was sizable. It was intense.
Yeah.
So I mean, I always perceived all that as like good and fun and positive, but now having deconstructed and walked out of all that,
Yeah.
looking back, I'm like, that would be so alarming if I were a Reading local watching this church do this. Like that would be really
Sure.
upsetting. And I kind of look back and understand some of those intensely negative attitudes they had. I'm like, oh, yeah, I think I get it. I think I might have felt similarly if I were in your position, Anyway,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so that's a good segue into, just I'm curious to know when you did start to begin to, ask questions or have doubts that maybe this wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Maybe we needed to look in different places.
Yeah. Well, so it's funny because like when I think back, I think of myself as having been like a fully Bethel person, and I think in a lot of ways that was true. But then when you think about like intellectually, philosophically, theologically, I don't think I was ever fully. I don't know. It's hard
It's
to think.
interesting. Yeah.
It's hard to separate.
I get that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I loved and drank deeply of the ethos at Bethel. I mean, I learned the language and I spoke it well. I was fluent. And not just the verbiage, like, because there's a whole lexicon to being a Bethel person, but also the ideas and the principles and the ethos around how we see the world and why, and the values. Like there's a whole way of thinking that I absolutely like bought into and embraced wholeheartedly to whatever degree. And then within that, I still, because I'm gay, right? So I've always had a queerness to me in any space I've been in. My dad is Japanese, my mom is white. I was raised in a tropical island, so everyone around me was brown. So I've always had this kind of like separate, different vibe, about how I've experienced the world. And so I've always paid attention to and like tried to understand what the common values were, so I could at least participate amicably, but also didn't have them instilled deeply within myself. And so the same was true at Bethel to whatever degree, that it plays out in that way. I still asked questions and pushed and whatever. So I had always been asking questions, but the thing that changed was when I started asking questions because I was like, I think we're missing something. I think this isn't it, right? And that came in 2020 when I finally came out to myself. I knew I was gay, but when I finally embraced that being gay was something that actually like was good and beautiful, not something tragic and awful and perverse and something that needed to change. When that happened, which was a whole dramatic journey, right? That was the catalyst that like compelled me to start asking questions and distrusting the answers I'd been getting from Bethel for a long time. And not just Bethel, like any church leader up to that point, but then especially Bethel, because I'd been at Bethel for 12 years by that point. So anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. Did they have space in there for, okay, I'm going a little bit off of personal experience from other people's stories that I've heard, where it's like you can quote unquote confess the sins of homosexuality, and maybe that means that you have to not be on certain leadership teams, or you have to definitely not act on them, or things like that. Was that, a worry of yours or something that you experienced?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It was a noose around my neck the whole time. I always, I mean, I don't think I've said it this way before, but like my time at Bethel, specifically when I was like in leadership and on stages and platformed, I 100% of the time had a noose around my neck. And I knew that, and I mostly just tried to ignore it or pretend like it wasn't there, but it was never not there. I was always noosed. So I knew the moment I slipped up, if I were ever to, and I never did, but if I were ever to have a sexual encounter with a man, that was going to be a big problem and I would lose stuff real fast. But what would be worse than a mess up or a slip up, which happened a lot, I would come to find out right later, like that happened a lot. Yeah. There were so many queer people at Bethel. I never slipped up, but I did the worst thing where instead of slipping up, I fully embraced who I was and my queer identity and was like, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm supposed to be like this, and saying otherwise is not okay. And that was absolutely a deal breaker. So I didn't get put on a purity plan when that happened, or like, discipline or whatever. It was over. And I watched the walls go up so fast. It was dehumanizing and like violating to watch these people who knew me for years, who watched me, just like instantaneously be done with me. I was shocked. And so that like kind of propelled my way out. But
yeah, it seems maybe bittersweet now, because on the one hand we were like, okay, I'm glad to be where I'm at now, but at the time when it is your identity, your livelihood, your community, it is
all those things.
It's horrible, because you're losing everything that is important to you and everything you've worked for. And I hate hearing stories like that. I understand that was my story too, and just like it's so. You use the word dehumanizing. I think that's it, because all of a sudden you realize you were an object to them to be used for whatever their purposes were.
Right.
It's just sad.
I'm like, oh, how long was I commodity? Why didn't I know that? I mean, in some ways I knew and didn't want to know. I turned a blind eye. It was fine as long as I was, getting rewarded for playing the part. And then once you didn't kiss the ring, your commodification was expendable, and you're like, oh God, this is awful.
Yeah. So I'm curious, 2020 is such a pivotal year for so many people.
So many, which I'm a 4 in the Enneagram, so that like just really bugs me. I wish that I was unique in that, but I'm not.
Well, you're not a unique person in this podcast either, because I too am a 4.
God. Nice.
That just means that our podcast will be amazing. But yeah, so when you said, you're starting to ask questions, you're coming out to yourself, and that's kind of what opened the door for you to ask questions. What are some of the questions that you're asking?
God, the first one was, are we wrong about this? Did we miss this? Is it actually possible that we have been wrong about the verses that have dehumanized and demonized and vilified me my entire life? Is that possible? That was the first big, terrifying question. And then I went hard. I studied for months and just voraciously, books, podcasts. I called people who were teaching in these areas and was like, please talk to me. And obviously my mind changed. My life changed. And I got to a point where I was like 100% non-negotiable. We are wrong about this. This is not okay. But then through that process, also, if you remember, in the middle of 2020, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, that whole event happened. And that was another component. It wasn't as centered or dramatic for me because it felt like this thing happening out over there while I'm in the middle of my coming out process. But I had a Black woman on my team that gave me proximity. Because, I'm not interested in making racial commentary around Bethel, but it's a pretty whitewashed, white supremacist space, and I didn't think about that when I was there very much. It just wasn't a focus or a priority because the way you think about the world kind of erases so much about human identities, unless you're a straight white man. Then all of a sudden, anyway, so that kind of also brought in another layer of consciousness for me that I just hadn't really had to think about. And so when I'm over here like confronting my homophobic and heterosexist friends for how they were treating me in my coming out process and expecting them to take my experience seriously, even if it wasn't theirs, all of a sudden I'm like, wait a minute, I'm not black. Yeah. But this is happening to people and I should care, which is so sad that I'm at like 31, 32, I'm 32 at this point, having this like thought process. I'm like, that's commentary in of itself, right? But so then I force myself to just kind of go on that journey and like reading and watching and listening and repenting, right? Just kind of grieving how like desensitized I was and racist some of my complicity was to attitudes and ideas and beliefs that were like dehumanizing to people of color. Anyway, so that was another layer that kind of came in. And then from there, I was like, we've missed it with queer people. We've missed it with people of color. Like Bethel doesn't have it. Like this is a problem. And I started listening to some of the black people I knew in the Bethel community. And I'm like, oh shit. Like they know, they're aware, and they're like being intentional and like careful about what they say and when and how and to whom, because they will lose favor and opportunity and whatever if they get too loud or opinionated about race. And so I'm like, oh God, this is so anyway, from that process, then I started asking questions about sexism and women, like women also, like, that came up. And then trans people was another layer of the queer experience that I, wasn't my experience, but like, hey, this, and so they just kind of cascaded and dominoed. And I was like, oh my God, there's so many different kinds of people in the world who have been erased by what I was taught in evangelicalism in general, and then especially at Bethel. And this isn't okay. And so then the patriarchy became something that I had to like look at, right? And power dynamics. And anyway, so just there was a lot of unlearning and relearning and like things that I should have learned a long time ago that I had opportunities to learn or whatever. And I couldn't hear it. There was no place in my worldview for any of that to matter. So that just like forced, and somewhere earlier too, I then had to start asking questions about the Bible. I'm like, okay, yeah. Where did this come from? I've been avoiding that question for a long time, So then when I started doing that deep dive, and then my attitude, I could feel my belief and my relationship around the Bible starting to change. I'm like, oh my God, if this changes, I don't know if I can come back from this, and what all else I'm going to lose, Anyway, it was like
process
for sure.
Yeah. And like we said earlier, your entire identity, livelihood, community is wrapped up into this. Right. So to give that up, I mean, that is huge. Yeah. And some of the scariest parts are difficult, some of the most difficult pieces about it. Is there anything else that comes to mind where you go, this was particularly difficult for me as I'm, kind of renegotiating all this?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest, I didn't say this, so I just want to say it for the sake of like putting on the table. The biggest, scariest thing about me coming out to myself at the beginning of all of this was I knew as soon as whoever found out about my convictions and my beliefs and attitude about this, because I knew I wasn't going to just be like flimsy or iffy about it. I'm like, if I make this decision, I'm going to fight for this. Like I just kind of, it's who I am. The justice thing, I can't let it go. I was like, if I cross this line, I know who I am. I know what I'm like. I know what will happen. I knew I was going to lose my teaching gig. I was going to lose the microphone, the platform, the speaking opportunities, the right standing with my Bethel community. I was going to lose so many relationships. I was going to lose all this respect and clout and prestige that I'd amassed for years, and my reputation and my identity. Like there was social equity that I had built. And I was like, I'm going to lose all of this because it's all been built within this specific niched, Tupperware of an existence. That's all going to go away. And who am I without that stuff? What do I have to offer the world without that stuff? Will I still have an income after this? Do I have like marketable skills that still, pertain to an area of passion for me? Because I was a business owner, so I had I know I'm an entrepreneur. I can make money, but like, am I going to make money doing things I don't care about? Probably not. So like, what's going to happen to, anyway, so those were like some really big, scary unknowns I didn't have answers for that I knew were going to get hit really hard by this. That was like probably the scariest, most difficult part of the process. And I think it's why it took me so long to get there was because because the noose was just I couldn't get rid of it, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So in that, was there any relief that you found? Like as you're slowly, untangling,
Yes.
discarding,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
the relief was all internal. It was all within
Mm-hmm.
myself. And I
Yeah.
didn't know what all that was going to look like. I just had to believe that there was hope and
Mm.
freedom and goodness on the other side of this huge, self-sabotaging step I was
Yeah.
taking.
Yeah.
But absolutely there was relief. And the relief came
Mm.
later. Like the more I closed the door to being subservient to, I'm just going to say Bethel culture for the sake of this context, but it was mostly like
Mm-hmm.
evangelicalism, right? Like just
Yeah. Yeah.
Trumper, right wing, conservative, evangelical whiteness. Like
Mm-hmm.
it was all of that. The more I definitively closed the door to having access and benefit and privilege from my proximity to that stuff, the more relief I was feeling in my soul, the more human I was feeling, the more at home I was
Yeah.
becoming in myself, because I think that some of this stuff had been bothering me for a long time and I just chose not to care or to look at it, right? It was,
Yeah.
I received benefits by
Yeah.
not looking at this
Yeah.
stuff. So relief continued to come in waves, but the biggest, most profound relief, I guess I will say, from all of that, it came later. Like, probably wasn't until I was in Nashville, because I was still like deconstructing and still like stripping my own internalized homophobia and the heterosexism from my own worldview. I was still having to unlearn so much, even after I'd come out to people and made some big choices. Somewhere along the way, I think after I came out publicly in 2022, and I don't know if there was a one moment, but like I got to a point where I finally felt safe within my own body, because I had, many emotional, interesting. I had been betraying myself my whole life, and I
Yeah.
didn't understand that. Like there's so much convolution around my beliefs and my identity and understanding of what was good and who God was, at least on a theological level. And so when I don't know, at some point I found myself being an out, proud, gay advocate for queer people and confronting harmful theology. And I felt connected and safe and like I could trust myself.
Oh,
And I
that's
didn't
huge.
know how much of that I didn't have for so long. Like you don't know the price you've been paying the whole time. So you can't really factor that into your accounting because you don't even know that stuff's being taken off the top. And so, yeah, that was like probably the biggest conscious relief that I was able to recognize, was an embodiment of wholeness and feeling aligned with who I'd been this whole time and not needing someone else's permission to ratify or validate who I was. Like I finally got to a place where that belonged to me, and I was no longer
Yeah.
looking to some outside hierarchical straight white man to validate my permission to exist the way that I'd been this whole time. That was like probably the pinnacle of the reliefs that came, and there were
Yeah.
so many, but anyway.
Yeah. I mean, clearly, like that's huge, right? It's like, and even as you're talking about it, it's like your body is feeling
Yeah.
that again. Like, oh, we have that now, it's, and even such a contrast from what we started off talking about, like, right? This, like the noose to going, like, I can actually breathe and I'm free to be myself,
Yeah.
which I think is so, beautiful in this process. When you think about some of the unique pieces about coming out of, Bethel, how do you feel like that might be different from people coming out of other groups, other churches, just some of the unique pieces that people are dealing with?
I'm only speaking this from coming out of Bethel, so I'm not really sure what it's like in other denominations. But from what I can imagine, especially based on the different types of Christians I've encountered on this side of the tracks, I think the uniqueness from coming out of the Bethel world is like Bethel is an echo chamber. It was such a tightly manicured subculture within Christianity, like it is, especially people who go through the school, like the whole point of the school is to rewrite your identity, is to erase who you thought you were and like replace that idea with you're a son or daughter of God, which means if you were assigned female at birth, you are female no matter what you think or how you feel or what your experience is, right? Like if you're attracted to the same gender, it doesn't matter. That's not true. That's been replaced. As a son of God, you now must be attracted to women. And that is all that can, anyway, so like it came with so much of that stuff. But it comes with like thinking about like kingdom, like dominionism, right? That's a term that I didn't know at the time, but like the seven mountain, whatever, like they're obsessed with that stuff. Like that's all that matters is like to give glory to God. It's just such a deeply personal like source of worship and like service to your deity to take over the world.
I think that's so important. Okay, so Bethel, are they a part of the New Apostolic Reformation? Are they part of that kind of group of people?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important for people to know, like the New Apostolic Reformation is very like lockstep with Christian nationalists in terms of the policies that they're putting forward, the prayer services, who they're praying for to be in power positions. And then, of course, the Seven Mountains Mandate theology, dominionism, Christian dominionism, which is, I mean, it's like it definitely goes beyond the quote unquote four walls of the church. It is your life bringing it out to the rest of the nation to save the nation at all costs.
Yeah. Laura, yes, absolutely. All that 100%.
Yeah.
I think I'm not realizing this as we're talking. I think, I don't know if it's true for every person who left Bethel, but it was definitely true for me. I think it's true for anyone who actually applied themselves at Bethel. If you genuinely bought in and were part of Bethel, one of the hardest things I had to let go of, and that I'm still probably one of the most embarrassing things about my involvement at Bethel was like having to shed the Christian supremacy that was so deeply embedded in the ethos. And of course, if you ask anyone outright, no one would admit this. No one's going to say it this way, but genuinely, Bethel, the thinking at Bethel is, I'm going to just say this in explicit terms. I understand there's nuance around this. I don't care. I'm just going to say it bluntly so we can get the point. People at Bethel believe they are the best version of Christianity that has ever existed, probably, right? Like we are it. Wow. We are the pinnacle of what it means to be close to God and like manifesting revival. And we've got proof. The signs, the wonders, the miracles, the testimonies, the healings, the accurate prophetic words, like whatever, all this stuff that you can't scientifically measure is justification to us to prove we're right. Like we know better. And so therefore we're now going to package all of this divine revelation we have in books and sermon series and like traveling and speaking and building platforms and a whole industry around God's voice coming through us as a house. Like we're anointed to bring healing. There's a healing anointing, right? There's anointing to go to the nations. And actually like this is all Christian dominionism, Christian nationalist like language for colonization, literal, and they don't think about it that way, right? Of course not. That's woke liberal terminology that's just trying to, right? But literally, the goal is to go out there and replace people's spirituality with what we're doing.
Yes.
No one's going to say it that way, but that is absolutely what the deal was. And so I would graciously go to other cultures and other churches and be hosted in the green rooms and whatever by these pastors. And I would teach them how to know God and how to, and it is embarrassing. And I have this smirk, but that was the persona. The celebrity culture at Bethel was in and of itself dehumanizing. And I was in it. I was like one of the circuit people and just, like I was. I mean, there was a Britney Spears effect, and it was like really fun for a while. And then I think after a while, I was like, I said this like to some of my interns and some close friends. I would like confess sometimes, like, this is a problem. Like, we're celebrities for Jesus. This is not this is not what I see in the Bible. This is not how I see, and also like, I feel like a piece of meat. I don't even feel like I'm a person when I show up in these spaces. People just want to come and take something from me. Like there's not relationship here. This is so transactional and it's so like business or it's contractual, and like, I'm like, some of this I didn't sign up for. I didn't, and so some part of me was still fighting for my humanity in the midst of all of these structures that exist. But absolutely the Christian supremacy was so awkward and difficult to let go of.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think this applies maybe to people at Bethel, because we have this focus on signs and wonders and right, like as you came out of that, or if people are listening going like, hey, I was in that too. How do you make sense of that on the quote unquote outside? Was that real? Was that, did it happen? Were people healed? Did the Holy Spirit make you laugh until you couldn't laugh anymore?
No. Good question. Ew. Yeah, it's an important question. And absolutely, that's definitely been stuff I've had several people who came out of Bethel with me, and we spent years processing through some of this and like mostly letting go of things. So I was never big in the healing stuff. I mostly tolerated it. It wasn't something that I was super focused on or that I cared about very much, and I didn't really trust the verification process of like if these things were happening. I'm like, do we know that? I don't know. We're making some pretty bold claims. Anyway, so I just kind of avoided most of the healing culture at Bethel, which was like one of the main aspects of Bethel's, ministry and impact. So I avoided a lot of that. I was more interested in the prophetic space, and within that, I was like kind of pushing the boundaries around the subject of discernment and like accountability and like getting to the bottom of something, and I became really well known for my class, the discerning of spirits, and I was teaching on spiritual intelligence, and so I had a very different like bent to all this stuff than what was typically like being celebrated in that world. But Laura, I'm going to level with you. I did have some experiences while I was in Reading that to this day, I'm like, what the hell was that? I don't know. And I'm not done pulling this stuff apart. I think a lot of the things that people claim are happening at Bethel can easily be, put away. Like, I think you felt really strongly about that. I think you wanted that to be true. I think you were looking for that, right? I think there's a lot of confirmation bias and whatever.
Yeah.
But there were some things, whether it was experiences I had or people that I knew and I was, in close relationship with, there were some things that I'm like, to this day right now, with all of my transformation and defecting, I'm like, I don't know if that didn't happen. I don't know. I feel like I'd be gaslighting myself to pretend like that didn't happen. Like, for example, this is really uncomfortable, but one of the services on a Sunday night, there was a baptism or whatever, which it was like mass baptisms. They would just like dunk person after person after person while we're singing,
Yeah.
And long story short, basically like there ended up being these like sparkles of light in the air throughout the sanctuary. That I'm like, what kind of technology can do that? I'm like genuinely trying to figure out scientifically, how is this happening?
Yeah.
What am I looking at? I could not process what my eyes were seeing. There were like little sparks of light, like gold yellow light, just flickering throughout the room, and people are losing their minds. Like people are like sobbing, people are worshiping like crazy, they're manifesting, whatever. And I'm just like staring at this empty space, like I don't know what to do with this information. This doesn't make any sense to me. I with my own eyes, I saw whatever I saw, and I don't know what happened. And so I'm like, I've heard about mass hysteria and mass hallucinations. I'm like, okay, maybe that happened. Is that possible? Is that what I experienced? And then awkwardly later at the end of that service, Laura, I'm going to betray both of us right now. My drunken, crazy boss and her, I'm assuming deeply closeted, very gay man, best friend, like prayed for me. And I don't know why. I honestly do think part of him being gay, he has never once expressed any kind of like identity as a queer person to me. So I'm totally projecting, or I'm totally putting this on him, but I am convinced that man is gay. And And so he was in his drunken state. He pulled me into a headlock and started prophesying over me. And when he's drunk, like his voice becomes a hell of a lot more limp-wristed, cliche, gay, lispy kind of vibe, right? And so he's telling me these things. And at some point, the prophetic word starts getting kind of profound. And I start feeling like, oh my God, this might actually be God. Like this might be true. And something happened to my brain, and there's probably science that we could like map what happened to me, but like I started laughing because my brain could not at that point. I think my brain gave up. I'm like, none of this is ridiculous. I started laughing so hard that I lost control of my legs. And then I fell onto a person that was like on the floor beneath me. And then like I couldn't walk for a little bit, and my housemate had to come and help me out of the sanctuary. And then I like hugged virtually every person I encountered for the rest of that night. I told people I just met that night that I loved them, and I was not that kind of a person. And I genuinely meant it. Like I loved people. We went to the grocery store, and they had to like steer me away from people because I was like, hey, you guys go to Bethel, don't you? And I'm just like, and I'm like, that person's so sad. Like, and I'm like, wanting to give them a hug, and they're like, Mike, stop. And they're like getting me out of there. And I just like yelled out the window on our drive back to the house, like, we're all so happy. We're all so happy. I was like in this other state, which I was not that person, but I felt in my body, I felt so good. And I've never done, especially at that point, I'd never done any kind of drugs. I'd never been drunk on alcohol, nothing like that. I was such a good Christian boy. I felt so good. I was like, if this is what people feel like when they're high, I totally get why people would want to get high all the time. This feels so good. I went to bed that night praying, like, God, please do not let me wake up tomorrow different. I want to feel like this for the rest of my life. It felt so good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Laura, I don't know what that was. I don't know what happened. And I could tell you a few different stories like this where I'm like, I don't.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm a pretty rational, self-aware, and I try to be objective, right? Kind of a person. Yeah. And some of these moments, I'm like, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know, right? You know. Anyway, so I would submit that as well.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, those are conversations I've had with several of my practitioners that I work with, because we have several clients coming out of Bethel and other churches like it. And they too are trying to make sense of, was this real? Was this not? There's certain things that is, with neuroscience and somatic work, we can explain pretty well. And then other things we're like, yeah, we might have to just learn what acceptance of the unknown is, and how much time and energy do we want to spend on it, which is going to be different for every single person, of course. Yeah. So I'm curious to know, what has been some of the most important things for you in your own healing journey as you've come out of this?
As it pertains to Bethel specifically, I think for me, it's been like having to do what I think I could do to make right what I was part of, because I wasn't just like an attendee, you know what I mean? Like I was on leadership at Bethel. Like my name was on the building or whatever. Like I was associated with this space, and I was part of advancing their agenda, and I was complicit with the things they were doing, whether I meant to be or not. So for me, healing was part of my healing process has required from me changing the narrative around my attitude and relationship with that stuff and that place.
Sure.
And I've been really intentional about not trying to drag any particular human being through the mud. I've got some stories from some individuals I could share that are horrific, and I'm not trying to like expose and take down any particular person, because I think a lot of us are victims to, this whole system. Right. But and I'm not saying those people should not be held accountable. They absolutely should. But I'm not on a vengeance campaign. For me, I'm like, I just needed to get in the way of and disrupt the notion that whatever kind of respect I carried in the public square, I needed to divest from and cut off what Bethel has stood for and continues to perpetuate in the world. I started speaking up publicly about this stuff. I came out publicly, I came out swinging, and then especially like with Bethel, just started like calling this stuff out, being like, this is not okay. This is not true. This is really harmful, and it's a lot. It's so much to look at and unpack. And so I just, at different ways, try and find opportunities to address and like confront some of that. So that was a big part of it for me, was like, I needed to something, like change my platform and get it to be saying something different, and like validating so many of us who were hurt by this stuff
Yeah.
and were just
Yeah.
ejected and dismissed and erased and forgotten. Like, I'm like, that's not okay. But then it's because that happens to so many of us from a lot of different kinds of churches, but Bethel has like a specific kind of, I don't know, it feels like a unique, because you have to become someone else to belong there, so to walk away, like it's a whole like culture shock of trying to reorient. So that was a big part for me, was like changing the narrative around my voice and what I've like allowed my image and platform to support and whatever. And then obviously another part of it has been like to take responsibility for the theology that I've had my whole life and the things that I was taught, not just Bethel, but then especially Bethel, like the racism and the white supremacy within my theology that I just wasn't aware of, that it was, they had just changed the language and codified it in a way that I could not recognize. When you translate this to the other people in the world who don't think the way you think and aren't, brainwashed in this particular way, this stuff does this to them. And this compels you to treat them this way and to ignore them. And so like that was having to unlearn so much, was another big part of my healing process. I had to find better answers. I'm like, I am ill-equipped. I have been part of some really harmful ideas in the world that I like thought were good. What do I think now? I've got to find better answers. So I had to do a lot of learning, and I'm still learning, right? But like I went hard. I mean, I read a lot of books, talked to a lot of different people to just like reorient my understanding. So my politics had to change, obviously, right? And my understanding of ethics, my ethics had to change, which is so weird to have to say that, but that had to happen, right? So it was like, for me, it was that, and then obviously, of course, the own personal journey of like so much of the relationships that I entertained, I had to like get better boundaries with people, and it was so awkward and painful to do that because I had to say no a lot. There was so much heterosexism and homophobia laced within nice Christianese that I'm like, no, I'm not saying yes to that. And these are with people I've known for years, right? And so like them not even recognizing their complicity with all this harmful stuff that I'm finally starting to like recognize. I'm like, oh, I can't be part of this anymore, and I can't be in right standing with you. I'm not making space for this to happen in my life. I'm not going to give you access to influence me in these ways anymore. I have to I got away from this stuff. So it was like those things, and that goes in many directions, but those are some of the big ones, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I get it. So one of the last questions we like to ask people is like, if you could speak to the person who is one day out of Bethel, what's a piece of advice or support that you would want to give to them?
Oh, man. I would say there is so much you've been told emphatically that is not true. And you're not going to be able to change your mind right away. But I would highly encourage you to embrace humility, embrace curiosity. It is going to take work. It is labor, but do the work. Go learn better. Bethel does not care about other people. Bethel cares about Bethel. And that sucks because these are really good people. They're really nice people. I think they genuinely think they're doing the right thing, but their priority is not for the well-being of humanity. They're very discriminatory about who deserves, rights, who deserves inclusion, who deserves a voice. And that's not okay. And so there's just some learning that's going to have to happen here. So I would highly encourage you to do that learning. Go get educated in whatever ways you have access, like learn better. There's so much better understanding available to us about how to love people, about how to support and care for people, especially marginalized groups. Like, you got to learn about this because Bethel has actually taught you the opposite. Bethel has taught you how to center and prioritize the rich white male. Like, that's what they're after. They would never say this, of course. And they have so many ways to like change the subject and deflect. But absolutely, you've been taught to be a custodian of the patriarchy. And we got to change that, So I would say that's probably my first one, is like, you got to relearn. It's crazy because we went to Bethel to learn, right? And we got scrubbed. So you got to go unlearn the indoctrination that you absolutely like lived within for however long you were there for. The other thing I would say is, don't be alone. Like, you were part of such an immersive experience that prioritized community, but absolutely prioritized a specific kind of person that was allowed to belong in that community. It's time to like discover a new version of that. So get around some other people who get it. Find some people who went through this as well, their versions of it. But like, people in the world who didn't experience this will not get it, and they won't understand. You won't be able to help them get it. They're not going to get it, and that's okay. But find people who do, and thankfully at this point now, enough of us out here. We are accessible. We're here. Find those people, communicate with them, get connected, network, whatever. Get around other people who've survived this, because it is no small thing. I think I'd say those two things. Yeah.
Oh, I think that's awesome. And leads me right into, where can people find you if they're wanting to, read your story that you're telling of yourself, to follow you on social media and get involved with the things that you're doing, because you are doing a lot.
Thanks. Yeah. I'd say check out my Instagram is probably my favorite place for people to find me. That's where I feel like I'm the most consistent. So Mike Maeshiro is my handle. But my website, MikeMaeshiro.com, is where all of the things that I'm doing as far as like getting access to and participating in the work that I'm putting out, like that's a good space. On Substack, I have my memoirs coming out. I'm writing it. It's called God Made Me Gay. So if you want to go check that out, that's there. I have a podcast called Confessions of a Reformer. So you can find my podcast wherever you get podcasts. I'm on TikTok, I'm on Facebook, I'm on YouTube, but I think Instagram's probably the best place. Yeah.
Love it. Yeah, I'll make sure to include all of that in the show notes.
Yeah, thanks.
Mike, it's been lovely to talk to you today. I feel like there's so many more things I could be asking you about, and we could just riff on. But we'll have to save that for, another episode, or like face to face, we'll go out and grab coffee or something.
Yeah,
since
love that.
I don't think we live too far away. So
yeah, Laura, yes. Thank you for having me, by the way. It's been an honor to share. I know this has been kind of a crazy journey for so many people, so I'm happy to just provide more language to it. But thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you again so much to Mike Maeshiro for joining us for this story episode, and sharing all about his experience at Bethel. And there was just so many more questions that I could ask. And, I realized this many, many years ago, but when you start peeling apart kind of the layers of Christian nationalism and understanding the people that are running it, the people that are promoting it, the people that are out there, kind of in the trenches and then in front of people, you start to see these different religious groups pop up. And the New Apostolic Reformation, which we talked about a little bit in the episode, is one that I've become familiar with over the last few years, and I was pretty sure that Bethel was a part of that. And they are very key central figures in not only pushing forward Christian nationalist legislation, but also, making sure their leadership is in connection with specific political parties' leadership. And on top of that, they have a lot of quote unquote Christian influencers who are doing brand deals and sponsored content with a variety of different brands in order to kind of bring a sense of relevance to Christianity, making it quote unquote cool to be a part of. I went down that rabbit hole, the Christian influencer rabbit hole, a few years ago. And it's really fascinating how many of them are tied to Bethel and its affiliates, the New Apostolic Reformation, and then ultimately Christian nationalism. So kind of a fun little family tree that we've got going there. Anyways, it's been so wonderful to have each of you here today. And, make sure that you go give Mike a follow on Instagram, check out his website and the things that he offers. It was great to have him here, and we will be back next week with another episode of Sunday School Dropouts. And with that, all God's people said, Amen.